And for a lot of you who are in here, been in the business 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years, don't think that this is just about being new. There is something in here for everyone. But it was really important to me over the years when I bring people onto my team or later on when I was opening and running offices to give people a roadmap. You know, how do you kickstart your career? What are some of the best practices? What are some of the best ways to get on the phone? So we're going to cover a lot of ground. And the nice thing about this module is where we end is a business planning method that if you use it is going to allow you to do what everybody says they want to do. Not everybody, almost everybody says, I want to make more money. Well, how do you do that? Everybody's got that idea of I want to make more money, but they don't know how to come up with a strategic plan to make more money. Most of you are running around right now like a chicken with your head cut off, and you really don't know how to fit more into a day. But I'm going to walk you through a process that's going to show you how to identify what you do to increase your earnings. But we're going to start from the ground up with Brokerage Jumpstart. And the first one is picking the right market. And I realize for some of you that ship has sailed, but think of it this way. Mike talked a lot about team brokerage. Elka talked a lot about building the right people, putting the right personalities on your team. But how do you give them guidance? I will never understand why, and I still see this all the time, where somebody brings a new person onto their firm or their team, and they don't have a vision for what that person's going to be doing. Welcome to commercial brokerage. Well, what does that mean? What am I going to be doing? How do we pick the right market? The wrong question, because this is a question I'm still asked quite frequently, is where is the market with the most untapped potential? I don't know, the moon? I mean, if it's a good product type in a good market, somebody's working it. So the rookie comes in and says, where can I go that nobody else is? It doesn't exist. It's fundamentally the wrong question. So what are the right questions? When I'm bringing somebody new into the business, there are 5 P's that I talk people through in terms of picking the right market that's going to be a good long-term fit for them. The first one is passion. And passion isn't necessarily, the thing that you dreamed about being since you were 3 years old. It may be something that you see yourself liking. But that's one thing when people would come in, they'd say, well, where's the untapped market? Where's the place with the most potential? And I'd say, that doesn't really matter unless you see yourself liking it. So it's a personal question, but it's an important question. There was a gentleman I worked with years ago, and he started off in office properties because at the time in our office, it seemed like the right place to start. It was relatively untapped, at least for us as a firm. And so he thought, I'm going to go into office. 5 years later, he was making a good living. He's probably net every year, say $200,000. And this is, 20, 25 years ago, so that's not bad money. Still today, it's not bad money. Some of you in here may be thinking, I'd love $250,000 a year. So he's making, between $150,000 and $250,000 year in and year out. But he hates office properties. He makes a switch to retail, which really, 5, 6 years into your career, it's pretty tough to switch product types. But he did it strategically, didn't completely abandon office properties until he had established himself in retail. Today, he is a $2 to $3 million a year net guy because he found something that got him excited to get up in the morning. So your personal passion does matter. But it's not that easy when you're bringing somebody new on because there's also a couple of other questions that are just as important. And I'm going to jump right down to number 4 and 5 real quick. First and foremost, does your firm value and support that niche? It's great if it's untapped, but if you're working with a firm that doesn't know how to support it, has no track record in it, then you are a pioneer, and that's going to be difficult to get moving when you have really nothing to leverage off of. So when somebody new is starting, I'd say, look, if you really want to be a pioneer, that's a choice you can make. But if somebody has already laid some groundwork for you, it's best to leverage off of that. The other question you got to ask yourself is, am I going to be an island? Am I going to be a lone wolf? Or is this something, a firm, an organization in which I can build a larger team? We've talked a lot in the time that we've been together that team brokerage is the present as well as the future. Not to suggest that lone wolves can't do okay in this business. They certainly can. I know some lone wolves that make a lot of money. But the problem is that most clients nowadays look at it and say, well, if I'm going to pay the same fee, I might as well get more than one person if you leverage your team properly. The second P is profit. This is another thing I do not understand. When you onboard somebody new as a leader, Do you see a money-making opportunity? And I'm not talking about, in theory out there, that there's money to be made, but if you identify the market, do you know how many sales and leases are taking place in that market? And if you were able to grab a reasonable amount of market share, is there enough money on the table for that person to make a reasonable living? When you came to work for me in one of my offices, I could look you square in the eye and say, Will, if you do your job, there's $250,000 in this submarket for you. And by the way, Will, I'm giving you the free franchise here. I'm not going to charge you a franchise fee. You got to work it, but I'm telling you there's $250,000 on the table for you if you even just this pond. Forget how we grow over time. That's a type of visionary leadership that is so often lacking in our business. It's like, hey, this is a great business. We're going to put you in. There's a desk, there's a phone. I'll go on some meetings with you. But do we give people a roadmap? And do we have some type of objective way of looking at it and say, look, there were 50 leases in this submarket, or there was 15 sales. If we grab 20% of those, this is what that looks like at an average fee. You have also got to pick a niche that you can keep up with. When Mike talked about the business development machine, there is no real theoretical limit to how big of an electronic footprint you can have. There is, however, a real significant limit on how many people you can call. And that's something that I see as a huge mistake. People come in and they make a database of 2, 3, 4, 5,000 people. That's okay if you've got a strong and robust electronic footprint, but you got to figure out which horse you're riding in this business. And I try to be fair about this because I have seen people make a lot of money in this business simply running a transactional style of business. And here's what I mean by that. I worked with a team out of Southern California that averaged, their cold callers each averaged 500 to 800 outbound calls per week, no ifs, ands, or buts. If you didn't do a minimum of 500 calls, you lost your seat. I knew another team where it was 200 calls a day, or you lost your seat. Now, that may seem extreme to you, but for some people, if you're running a transactional model, are you looking to buy, sell, or lease? The answer is no, goodbye. You looking to buy, sell, or lease? The answer is no, goodbye. You looking to buy, sell, or lease? If you do enough of that, you'll make money. I wouldn't suggest otherwise because I've watched people make a lot of money doing that. I'm not that person. A little bit of confession here. One of the reasons that Elka's presentation was so powerful for me is we were using DISC 15, 20 years ago as a main personality profile test for hiring new people. And here's one thing that DISC taught me about myself, which helped make the beginning of my career make so much more sense. And I was thinking when Marcia was very honest earlier about her resistance to cold calling. I promise you, none of you had call reluctance that was bigger than mine. And now, let's face it, there's lots of people in this world that could never pick up a phone. They just can't do it. But of the people who can discipline themselves to pick up the phone, I promise you, you weren't more scared to pick up the phone than I was. Okay? I'm an S, by the way. Okay? I asked Mike to guess. He actually guessed correctly. I guess we've learned some things about each other over the years. But there is a reality to this that I had to really embrace because I knew that I wasn't going to be the guy that was going to make 200 phone calls a day. But if you give me 25 calls to make that are researched properly, and I'm going to talk a little bit about selling by phone here in just a few minutes, but if you give me 25 where I know the people, I know that I can add value to it, I'm looking long term to build a relationship with them, I learned I could do that. And so if you're going to drive more of a relationship model as opposed to a transactional model, you have to make sure that you are creating a pond that is manageable for you. And the math simply doesn't lie. I can tell you that in tracking my metrics throughout my career, every 7 times I dialed the phone, I had a conversation. Some of you may work in markets where that ratio is lower. I've worked with people in rural markets where 1 out of every 3 or 4 times they dial the phone, they get somebody. I've also worked with people in New York and Chicago and San Francisco where it's probably 1 out of 10 or 12. They rarely get somebody on the phone. When you know what your model is, you have an idea of what you can keep up with. So if you're trying on average, at some point you've got to move on, but if you're trying on average 4 times to get a hold of everybody in your database and you're going to call, say, 48 to 50 weeks a year, the math doesn't lie. So when somebody says to me, I got a database of 3,000 people, I know you are not keeping in touch with all those people. You cannot be. Maybe you're emailing them, maybe you're connected with them on social media, and that's fine. I'm not discounting the importance of that, but I know one thing, you aren't even talking to a small percentage of them every year. It's just not possible. So when new people start out, I say, are we giving you a slice of the pie that you can handle if you're driving a relationship model for building your brokerage business? This I alluded to, so I can move on from this pretty quickly, but when I think about probability and potential, those are the last two P's. I group those together. Probability is, whose track record are you going to leverage, and who is going to guide you through the nuances of this? Every year, every time we do Lipsy School and our travels, I run into somebody who is got all the spirit and vigor and desire and innate intelligence to make it in this business, but they have no mentor. They have nobody to teach them what they should be doing. Poor Melinda. There you go. So somebody like Melinda who brings, say you bring everything to the table that it takes to be successful in this business, but you don't have anybody to teach you the nuance, that's a problem. And for new people, we have to raise probabilities by giving them a guide in this business. Commercial real estate, Mike Lipsy, for 35 years now, I think that the Lipsy Company has been an independent firm, really has no competition in this business. And why is it that this huge business that we have has no real formal learning, no higher institution? I mean, you can go to USC or University of Wisconsin at Madison, Arizona State University that have some good real estate programs, but this isn't what they teach. What they teach is an institutional type of real estate. And that doesn't help so much with what we're doing. So we recognize that our industry, we're a tribe. We're a tribe. And what a tribe relies upon is a tribe relies upon the people who have been in the tribe for a while to pass on the traditions and best practices to the next generation. So when you bring somebody on, or if you're a new person coming on, who is your guide? And if you don't have the right guide, maybe you need to make a switch. I'm not picking on Brent, but I believe at the last Lipsy School that was something that maybe you realized is maybe you weren't at the right place with the right mentors or the right guides for this business. Is that fair to say? Okay, so Brent made a change. You've also got to think about the potential to grow. Now, to be fair, when somebody new would come on, they would often say to me, Tim, I want to make $1 million. And I'd say, that's awesome. Let's focus on putting the first $10,000 in your pocket. How about that? And I don't mean that disrespectfully or sarcastically to the new person, but you got to start somewhere. But is there a logical path to growth? And do you want to go down that path? So picking a market is not just not that we would ever think of it this way, but it's not just throwing the dart at the board and seeing where it lands and going, I'm going to go there. Or even worse yet, hiring somebody into your firm, if you're running a boutique firm, and I know we've got some people here that are running teams, and saying, hey, welcome on board, you've got all the right stuff, we'll figure it out in a couple of months what you're going to be doing. That's the death knell for somebody. Take them through this process. Michael gave you a lot of best practices for building a database that sets you apart. When I work with mid-level and senior agents, typically when they come on for coaching or consulting purposes, I'll ask them about what are some of the biggest obstacles they're facing to move their business forward. Of the top 3 answers, the one that I get the most frequently, probably 70% of the time, is I want to move forward, my database sucks. Database is one of the biggest things that holds people back. They reach a natural earnings cap because their database is not situated, it was never built in a way that they could leverage and scale. We all know what I call the two-dimensional database process. Okay? We've got to find a way to get our base data. And you can get base data anywhere. I was working with a coaching client last year in, well, we have some people in here that know this really well, Lake Charles, Louisiana. Any famous people here from Lake Charles, Louisiana? Mike Lipsy, baby. That's the hometown of Mike, okay? Lake Charles, Louisiana in 2019 is about a 40,000 person MSA, so it's still not all that big. And he said, we don't have CoStar, we don't have Xceligent, which is gone now. We don't have all these resources that you have in the big city, so I don't know how to build a database. I said, well, you do what we did 25 years ago. You call the title company. Well, I don't know if you could do that. I promise you can do that. I know for a fact you can do it, and I'll tell you why I know you can do it. Is every property everywhere in the U.S. being charged property tax? Yes. Then you can do it. Okay, you might have to be a little creative, and we did have to be, but you can get base data anywhere you go. And then, of course, we all know that typically what comes back is not the true ownership, it's true ownership from a tax entity standpoint, but I can't call up and say, you know, is this the Skinner 4 LLC? You know, I mean, I don't sound good if I do that. So I've got to get to the true owner. And I'm going to use some combination of Corporation Commission, Secretary of State, different resources to make sure that I actually have a person I can ask for. And then depending on the type of firm you're with, some firms invest a lot of money in that last step, which is being able to help you find real contact information for that person. How many of you have wrong phone numbers in your database right now? All of you do, okay? Everybody's got some, and your database is never going to be 100%. Okay? But some of you are better off than others because there are different types of resources. Some are free, some are moderate payment, some are very expensive. But we've got to have a way to at least do this. This is the two-dimensional database process. But if you ever come to work for me, there was something I required of you in building your database, right? And to me, it's taking your database a couple dimensions beyond this. It was not just getting the property data and the true owner and the phone number, which I admit is important. But if you're going to work for me, you were going to do this. You're going to, first and foremost, make sure that all your properties are what we call geocoded. What is geocoding? Anybody know what geocoding is? Yeah, it's your latitude and longitude, which is, by the way, that's how things really work. Everything ultimately comes down to latitude and longitude. If your company doesn't have a geocoder, Texas A&M University has one of the best free online geocoders you can find. What are my Aggies? What's your tagline? Any Aggies in here? No Aggies? Really? It's like the largest alumni network in the United States. There's almost always an Aggie somewhere. But is it GIG'em? Is that what the Aggies say of Texas A&M? Great online geocoder. So even if you're working in the smallest market and your data came from a place that has no latitude and longitude on your properties, run it through A&M's geocoder. It'll have a latitude and longitude on every single one of your properties. Then you can go to the next step, which is to put them on a map. And I get a lot of pushback of this from new people, but I'm telling you, this is a step, in my opinion, you can't skip. Because when you can put them on a map, you can drive them. And when you can drive them, you can photograph them. And I tell you, especially when I was launching guys in Arizona, especially if they had a July and August, they're like, are you kidding me? You want to go out and drive and photograph properties in August? There was an old, back when Jeff Foxworthy was really popular and he was doing that, you know, you're a redneck. There was one in Arizona that said, you know you're from Arizona when you can drive your car several miles without actually touching your steering wheel. Okay, I mean, that's summertime, and when I was raised, two of my kids were born in Arizona, and the seatbelt's a deadly weapon. I mean, you burn your kids if you're not careful in Arizona. And I would still make you drive every single property. Why do you think I did that?
Market knowledge.
Exactly.
My broker made me do it.
My broker, yeah. Yay, Perry! I know. I love his manager's great. I have the utmost respect for his manager.
In the summertime, too, actually.
In the summertime. So that's why Kevin was laughing so hard during that. Absolutely. No ifs, ands, or buts. And let me give you a couple layers as to the why. Sometimes I would have people say, Tim, I don't need to go drive and photograph all these properties. I was born and raised in this neighborhood. I know all the streets. Yeah, but you weren't a commercial real estate agent when you were growing up. And let me tell you why that's different. When you go to photograph a property, here's what happens. Oh, shoot, where do I pull over? There's no place. Oh, I missed the entrance. Oh, there's a median here. I can't. You slow down and you start to look at the real estate in a way that you never did before. You see medians, you see curb cuts, you see trees that need to be pruned back, bushes that are too high. I couldn't find any place to park. Maybe it's underparked. You will never look at real estate the same when you're new if someone has the kindness, and I do consider it kind, to force you to drive every property and photograph it. Because I've seen people take a shortcut and say, well, I drove the whole neighborhood. You didn't slow down. You went 40 miles down the road and went shopping center, office building, flex. That's different than taking your life into your own hands when you're on the median and cars are going by at 60 miles an hour and you're being forced to take a picture. You cannot replace that learning. Back in 2001, Cushman & Wakefield bought out a company called Cushman Realty Corporation. I remember Cushman Realty Corporation. Cushman Realty Corporation was started by a guy named John Cushman, who was the great-grandson of the Cushman of Cushman & Wakefield, but he did his own thing. He gave the most amazing interview. I'll never forget it. And it's something that I think we've lost a little bit, and it's part of the reason why I always force my people to do this. He said, when I started, and especially when my great-grandfather started in the business, brokers didn't make as much money as they do nowadays. But they knew their neighborhoods like the back of their hand. They knew people by name. They knew every tenant. They knew every back alley. They knew everything about their neighborhoods. Technology has allowed us these days to spread farther afield, but it hasn't necessarily made us better brokers. Now, I do believe that there's a way to meld the best of modern technology with old school brokerage. But if you don't do this in your farm area, if you don't force your new people to do this, they will never reach that level of expertise that allows them to do so many of the things that we've talked about here today. I am constantly pressed, in our training and consulting business, we're constantly pressed with this idea of how do we differentiate ourselves? And people think it's about maybe being a better presenter or being more articulate or having a bigger vocabulary, but it's really not. We're going to touch on some things this afternoon that I think are true differentiators. But if you force your people to do this, they will differentiate themselves simply because they will know product and the properties in a way that most of their competition will not. Now, for those of you, especially for those of you in office, it's a little impractical to have people do stacking plans for everything, but over time they should be working on their stacking plans as well so that they can understand what makes up those buildings and eventually fill in all those expirations that really makes them deadly when they're out there prospecting. But at a minimum, you need to do this. And if you haven't, if you're a little bit of, maybe you're a year, 2, 3 years into this business and no one was kind enough to make you do this when you start it, then make a goal right now that you're going to get out there and do it. I realize you may have to integrate it into a much busier schedule now than you had when you were brand new, but it will pay dividends. So I'll tell you, one of the most powerful phone calls you can make is, "Hi Melinda, this is Tim Rios with the Lipsy Company. You know, I saw that you're resurfacing the parking lot. It looks like things are going well right now. What does Melinda immediately know about me? I did my homework." And how many other brokers called Melinda this week to say, "Hey, I saw that you were redoing the parking lot"? Certainly not the majority. Maybe somebody else did, but I can tell you that it's not the majority. So if you want an ancillary benefit to getting out doing this besides just market knowledge, it's the fact that you have real-time information to call people and say, "I was just at the property, this looks beautiful." Most brokers nowadays don't do that. You pick an area. So one standard that I held my people to is what I wanted them to do, because I wanted them to take advantage of the ability to call fairly quickly, is you've got to pace it. So I would have them do, if they had a lot of hours in a day, I never had anybody do more than driving 25 properties in a day. Usually it was more like 10 or 15, because when you add up the time it takes to drive it, photograph it, finish your research, and then make the call, there's only so much you can do. But what's amazing is that if you compound that over time, over the course of 2 or 3 months, you can get through hundreds of properties. But now you are a fundamentally different broker than when that process started. It's wonderful that we're getting so many testimonials on this, so clearly I'm preaching to the choir when it comes to this. But some of you right now, maybe even some new people, you weren't taught to do this. And it's something that you need to do, and you need to make sure that if you're bringing people on your team, you're having them do it too. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about this. And this is not an exercise in futility. This is an exercise in decreasing the time between when you start and when you start making money. And you know, it's a tough row to hoe. When you bring in somebody new onto this business, it's like, you know, they're 9, 10 months in and they're buying expired bologna on an Aldi card. You know, it's like they don't have, it's tough, right? It gets really, really rough. Okay, so what do you need to know? Now you're new, you're in this database building process, this is happening at the same time. You got to know some stuff. You remember this from day one? Now, I kind of feel like putting somebody on the spot, but when I went out that night with Jim and I went to dinner that first night, and I said, "Jim, you're in St. Louis, right?" He said, "Yeah, I'm in St. Louis," and we started talking about the market. And off the top of his head, Jim was like, "Yeah, we're 2.6 million people, 300,000 inside the city limits, and this is what we have in the suburbs, and this is the various counties and over the Illinois line." And I mean, this guy knows his market. This guy knows his market. So that was something that impressed me. And I need you to ask yourself this question. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands because I don't want to embarrass anybody. But if I asked you right now, key questions in all of these, and let's start with a basic one. How many people in your MSA? How many people within the city limits? Okay. Do you know anything about how that breaks out, daytime versus full-time? I'm guessing that more than half of you can't answer that question right now. And that's not meant to insult you or hurt your feelings. It's just that you've got to be able to speak about the market with authority. You don't have to know everything, but it's good that you can demonstrate it with some level of proficiency. There's something that's not in this slide deck, but I want to share with you because it's always been a guiding light for me, if you will, in the things that I've done with clients over the years. And I was taught this very early on. This mentor said to me, Tim, when you are in front of a client or anybody who can make a decision about buying, selling, or leasing real estate, there are two questions you have to answer in their mind. They don't even always recognize this explicitly, but deep down, if you don't answer these two questions, you will not get hired. Question number one, what are you going to do for me that I can't do for myself? Is there any legal requirement that somebody use an agent to transact their commercial real estate? None whatsoever. You have no legal protection. You know, that's not true in a lot of industries. I can't, just because I read a book on neurosurgery doesn't mean I can operate on your brain. Okay? So, but there is no legal requirement. So what are you going to do for me that I can't do for myself? The second question is, what are you going to do for me that another broker can't do cheaper, faster, better, you know, some insert your adjective, but that's you against your competition. So can you demonstrate expertise, at least in something that is beyond what the owner can do on their own? And part of that is knowing the market really clearly. We already talked about this one too, so I can move on from that fairly quickly. But here's the litmus test, at least in the markets where I hire people, mostly in the Midwest and also the Southwest. I would require that they know comps historically back to a certain point in time. My typical was if you were in a specific submarket, know your submarket trends for the last 10 years. Now actually I didn't really pick 10 years as an arbitrary number. It might sound kind of arbitrary, but if you go out through the last 80 or 90 years in commercial real estate, 10 years is a pretty full cycle. In fact, no matter how much somebody overpaid going into a recession, 10 years has basically wiped out every loss in real estate throughout history. So 10 years is a really good snapshot of time. You will capture an up market, a down market, and you'll have an understanding of what happened in the trends. Now, you can't know every comp like the back of your hand for 10 years. That's way too much information for most people. But you should know the submarket trends going back a decade. And then my minimum requirement for people that work for me is if I quiz you about any comp that fits into your farm area or where you say you are a specialist, you better know it. And in some cases where I knew it was a market where a lot of information was available, my requirement was 3 years. Does that take some homework? You better believe it. My people went home at night with a binder full of comps, and they studied those. So when you're out there binge watching Game of Thrones, you can study your comps. You know, this is not a prime time activity. This is something that doesn't require. In fact, I sure hope you're not doing it at 10 a.m. in the morning, because that's prime time for meetings and calls. So don't be doing stuff like this when you could be in front of clients. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. Elka talked about this. This is not a 40-hour-a-week job, but not every hour of the day is created equally. I love what she put that chart up. I have a very similar chart about what your time is worth per hour. And the reason I do think that 2,080 is the right denominator is because 2,080 is about all the hours you have in a year when it's socially acceptable to make calls and go on meetings. That's about all you have. So if you think of everything else, what my pop used to call getting ready to get ready, if you put everything else in a different bucket, you should not be doing that stuff inside those 2,080 hours. It doesn't make this unimportant, it's just not a prime time activity.